Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module called Historical Development of the Discipline in the course Political Sociology. This module will look at how political sociology and its theorization emerged from the Marxist Hegelian perspective. Then it went on to the Weberian perspective, and this was also discussed in terms of the circulation of elite theory of Pareto and Mosca, and later this went on in the behavioralist and functionalist theorizations in America. These comparisons are being made in this particular module, and we'll see how the texture and the contours of this particular discipline emerged firstly from Europe and then in the rest of the world. While it is commonly argued that political sociology as a distinct subject emerged during the mid-19th century, many thinkers such as Runciman and Bottomore proposed that the concepts and concerns outlined by the discipline started to emerge much earlier in the early 19th century. These scholars trace the emergence of the discipline to the writings of thinkers such as Adam Ferguson, Saint-Simon, and Hegel, and argue that an unraveling of the history of political sociology calls for an unraveling of the history of early European political thought. This is because the basic premise on which the emergence of the discipline rests, which is the idea of a separation between the political and most especially the state from the social, has its root in the work of the above mentioned thinkers. While a detailed discussion around their arguments regarding the relationship between the state and society should be pursued later in the course of the module, it is suffice to say that a theoretically coherent account of the historical developments of political sociology has to dig deeper into the debates around state power, civil society, and so on, characteristics of the 18th and early 19th. Likewise, a theoretically sound description of the course of growth of political sociology cannot ignore the interdisciplinarity distinctive of this discipline. While it is true that both these disciplines are similar in their concerns for the state and society relationship, as well as in the concern for the concept of power, the latter being a concept critical to both political science and political sociology, yet these subjects differ in the lines of inquiry. Political science is concerned with looking at the operation of governments, the process of legislation and administration, and on the front stage, agencies of the government, as opposed to political sociology, which tries to direct its attention to the backstage operations of power and looks at government as one of the many locations of power for which many social groups and individuals compete. This implies that political science focuses its attention to the formal organization and its operation and distribution of power, while political sociology takes such kind of power as already given and tries to move beyond this to the hidden reality of politics. In this sense, then, the crucial difference between these disciplines, as has been highlighted by many scholars, is in fact that while the former deals with the effect of the state on society, the latter tries to look at society's influence on the state. However, despite the differences, the boundaries between these two disciplines are fuzzy and constantly shifting, and the distinctions springing from their treatment of the question of the relationship between state and society are blurred today because of the constant variations in their theoretical vantage point. This also makes the task of determining the subject matter of political sociology a complex exercise, given the presence of various theoretically diverse positions within social sciences. Hence, tracing a historical trajectory of the discipline involves looking at all these myriad positions and debates regarding the relations between political and the social that come to shape the contours of the discipline. For the purpose of the current module, I have divided these debates into two sections. The first is a brief sketch of the history of ideas, part of European political thought that emerged from early 19th century onwards to the writings of Marx and his followers and critics, which I shall label the historicist approach. This is because Marx thought it also seen as rooted in history, as Bottomore puts it, as philosophy of history. This section shall focus on the basic principle around which the emergence of political sociology rests, which is the separation of the social from the state. Debates related to the emergence of the modern state on power shall also find brief mention in the section. The second section, on the other hand, focuses on the debates that emerged in the later half of the 19th century and helped shape the nature of the discipline in its later stages. These debates pertain to the behavioralist and structural functionalist schools of thought that emerged in American context, which tried to incorporate a more empirical approach in their analysis and political systems. The historicist approach. As already mentioned, the history of political sociology can be traced to the idea of a separation between the social and the political or the state. Here the attempt is to construct the state as a concrete political agency or structure distinct from social agencies and structures of the society in which it operates, acting on them or being acted upon. While it is true that Marxism also builds on a similar distinction of the social and the political, drawing from its critique of Hegelian thought, the roots of such an idea found expression earlier than it is assumed. W.G. Runciman, in his book Social Science and Political Theory, provides an excellent account of what the history of such an idea has been and serves as a useful text for the purpose of the subject of the module. Runciman argues that while this idea found explicit expression in Hegel's writing in the 1840s, such an idea existed much earlier in the more unfinished and covert form in the debates regarding the transposition of natural law to natural right that occurred between Rousseau and Grotius. However, as Runciman argues, Rousseau's idea of the divide between man and citizen was actually a severance of man in a state of nature and man in civil society, and not between society and political as such. In fact, this, he proposes, remains the problem with later writers such as Adam Ferguson, whose seminal text, An Essay on the History of Civil Society, while addressing the idea of state and civil society, does not outline a clear divide between the political and society. Saint-Simon's work has also been accused of similar shortcomings, and despite his ability to outline the relationship between the economic structures of society as being the base for the formation of the state and outlining a separation between government and administration, he is unable to demarcate between the social and the political. Rather than showing us the interconnections between government or the political and administration or the social, he divests the political out of the government and refrains from approaching the question of the simultaneous existence of the political and society. This coexistence of the state and society was also dismissed by anarchists, none of whom believed the need for a certain form of political organization as crucial for the continuation of society. For them, the state stood for all the vices of mankind and had to be done away with. Clearly then, while the idea of modern state, of sovereignty and of society were prevalent in propositions put forth by these thinkers, a clear idea of the separation of the state and society only emerged with Hegel's philosophy of right. In fact, much of the literature around the historical developments of the discipline trace the origins of the discipline to Hegel's writing. Hegel argued for a clear distinction between the state and civil society, where the latter was seen as a product of modern capitalism and free market economy. Such a society was characterized by people coming together to serve certain common and individual interests through the law, which is a guarantee of property, and through other external associations. These varying interests imply the existence of asymmetries and conflicts within civil society, which emerge as a problematic for the state. The state for Hegel is considered as a universal, which includes under its rubric civil society rather than coexisting with it. However, the idea of state as universal, which alone can resolve the contradictions generated by civil society between different classes, interests and modes of production, was seen as problematic for Marx, who dismissed this idea on the grounds of its exaggeration of the role of the state. Marx's critique of Hegel lay in the fact that for Marx, the conflict produced by civil society was crucial for the sustenance of the state and heavily relied on by the state. The state for Marx was embedded in the economic conditions of life brought about by mode of production characteristic of capitalism, and was seen as subsumed under the domain of civil society. Civil society here is seen as almost coterminous with bourgeoisie society and is seen as reinforcing socio-economic inequalities attributed modern capitalism. The crucial question for Marxist analysis then is to do with the extent of autonomy enjoyed by the state in its relation to the primary developments of civil society, namely social classes. In fact, this question regarding the autonomy of the state evolved as a crucial point of debate within the discipline and has produced three major theoretical positions which have contributed effectively in shaping the history of the discipline. These are the pluralists, the elite theorists, and the theory of class analysis. The theory of class analysis, emanating largely from the Marxist positions, came to dominate during the mid-1970s and underwent a split regarding the positions on the relationship between state and capitalist society. This split expressed itself in the form of the instrumentalists and the structuralists. The instrumentalists, such as Miliband and Domhoff, argued for the presence of the capitalist class that directly rules and controls the state as seen as part of capitalist society. The structuralists, on the other hand, such as Polontas, claimed that while the state was part of the capitalist society, it was yet relatively autonomous and not ruled directly by the capitalist class. This is because capitalist class structure demanded the state to fulfill certain needs of capitalist accumulation, and it was the structure that used the state to ensure class dominance. Hence, here the state, while appearing to mediate between different class interests, helps keep the class structure intact. The pluralists in this sense are closer to the primary Marxist position in terms of both being society-centric theories rather than state-centric, yet the position on the nature of existence of the state and on the operation of power is radically different from the Marxist one. Pluralists attempt to describe the power relations as they actually exist in a liberal society, which are not seen as related to the larger questions about the class that owns the means of production or about unequal distribution of skill and resources. For them, the state is seen as a neutral arbitrator between different competing interests within society, where no particular interest dominates and polity is underlined by a value consensus. This sense, then, it is also dismissal of the zero-sum conception of power, whereby some have all the power as opposed to others. Such a view is diametrically opposed to the position taken by the elite theorists, who willingly accept the importance of the state and argue for its autonomy from society. In fact, the idea of independent political factors playing a role in determining individual liberty or the nature, form of polity is reinforced in this school of thought. Such a theory emphasizes on the growing similarities between the political structures of all societies, which are seen as unaffected by the varying socio-economic context and are based on universal asymmetry in the distribution of skills, in the position occupied by different individuals, and so on. Elite theories such as Mosca argue that all societies are characterized by two classes, those who rule and those who are ruled upon. It is with the former that a monopoly of power rests, as opposed to the latter who are majority under the control of the former. Likewise, Pareto also makes similar arguments regarding elite rule being a universal that relies for its survival on the disparities between individuals. While both Pareto and Mosca differ in the way this elite rule is carried out, both concur on the fact that state and society is underlined by an unavoidable division of power between the elites and the rest of society. In this sense, then, such a theory seems rather close to the class analysis position in terms of its outline of power as being concentrated in the hands of a few and not shared and dispersed like pluralists would argue. However, because of its highly state-centric approach, it is also markedly different from the Marxist position. This brings us back to the theme regarding the boundaries between the state and society, and as clearly evident from the above outlined discussion, the question of ascertaining where the state ends and society begins, or whether there is a need even for such separation, are crucial questions that have been responsible for the foundation of this discipline. What the trajectory of political sociology has been after these debates emerged in the European context is a question that one shall explore in the next section of this module. Emergence of the discipline in the American context, functionalists and behavioralists. The previous section highlights how Western Europe remained the center of discipline right from the inception of political sociology till late 19th century. This section shall direct attention to how post-Second World War, the hub of the discipline shifted to America. While the previous concern of the discipline was regarding the development of industrial capitalism, caste conflict, elite power and so on, the emergence of participatory democracy became a prime object of focus for the discipline in the American context. Such an idea first found expression in Alex de Tocqueville's influential text titled Democracy in America, which deviated from Marx's obsession with the Industrial Revolution and paid greater attention to the emergence of democracy. He looked at the effects of democracy in terms of its tendency to create greater social equality, challenge hierarchy, alongside also its potential to threaten individual freedom. Largely, however, Tocqueville made a case for the coexistence of social institutions with the political one, rather than arguing for the importance and autonomy of one over the other. The idea also finds expression in a different form in the writings of one of the most influential political sociologists, Max Weber. Weber is credited with the first adequate understanding and definition of modern state, and its contribution to the discipline is essential to outline in making sense of the theoretical undercurrents underlying the discipline. Weber defined the state as a human community which successfully claims within a given territory the monopoly over the legitimate use of force. Weber's political sociology argues for centralization of the means and forms of administration, highlights the role of the nation, state, and understands society as underlined by the currents of rationalization. However, largely, Weber's contribution also rests in his caveat regarding the defining of the state in terms of its functions. While the reason for such cautioning have all been well spelled in Runciman's account of political sociology, what comes to the fore in discussion, in fact, that Weber provided an efficient critique of the functionalists. Functionalism as a theory owes its existence much earlier to the writings of scholars like Emile Durkheim, Radcliffe Brown, and Malinsky and so forth, which largely influenced the early subject matter of sociology as a whole. However, its emergence within political sociology in the American context specifically can be traced to the 1950s and 1960s in the writings of Parsons and Easton, who emphasized on the importance of functions rather than structures. Broadly speaking, functionalist position viewed the state as a unit of a larger social system whose relation to other units was that of integration and adaptation. This relationship of complementarity and consensus between different subparts of the system is seen as accounting for the larger solidarity of the system. This gets reiterated in Parsons' social system theory, where the state and society are subsumed together under a social system whose parts are bound together by an overarching and unified set of values and norms. The idea, however, became the subject of a massive critique and in opposition gave birth to an alternate model focusing on conflicts and constraints articulated by theorists like Ralph Dahrendorf. This looked at the functionalist desire for consensus and equilibrium as an inefficient attempt at resolving the contradictions present in society. From the vantage point of the conflict theory, the idea of common values and consensus are a product of political authorities that relies for its operation on the use of force in some measure. This is why conflict theorists find it essential to focus on the forces that resist this political authority and demand change in society. Clearly then, as Bottomore highlights, the history of the discipline gets shaped by the emergence of four basic models. While the first two models debating the autonomy of the political organization has formed the content of the previous section, the other two approaches of stability and consensus versus conflict and contradiction have come about in the current discussion. Furthermore, Bottomore also draws attention to other sets of debate prevalent within the discipline which act to shape its broad contours. This brings us to another essential theoretical model that is seen to have radically upturned the orientation of the discipline in the past 2 decades. This is the behavioralist view that believes in a cause and effect based analysis of events and argues for a shift in focus from the state to the observance of political behavior as it plays out in actuality. It adopts a single-dimensional view of power and takes up micro-level approach to the study of politics. Behavioralists argue against the massive and historical emphasis of the state, which considered by them as highly normative approach. Rather, they argued in favor of studying empirically observable facts revolving around individual and group political behavior such as voting, political values, and so on. This was juxtaposed against the interpretative approach that argued that rather than looking at behavior as directly observable in empirical fact, society has to be studied according to the interpretation of the meanings of the rule-based social action. This was the phenomenological position which could trace its roots to Weber's interpretative sociology. Likewise, Weberians also outlined other critiques of the positions which have all been well documented by Folk's work, which deals majorly with the problems inherent within the behavioralist positions. Drawing from King's argument, he points out how such an approach overlooks the question of importance of the state and the centralization of power within the state. Similarly, it is also uncritical of the existing asymmetrical power relations, characteristic of the political economy of liberal democracies. Likewise, behavioralists such as Easton, who propose an input-output model and advocate the idea of political system based on an authoritative allocation of values derived from various sources, have also been subjected to criticism for its inability to point out how such authority is acquired or why the idea of political system is any less ideologically charged than the state. Such critiques then serve as valuable contributions that have acted effectively to shape the discourse around politics and are essential to analyze in making sense of the present nature of existence of the discipline. To conclude, therefore, we have seen in this module that the first understandings of political sociology began with the understanding of state-society relations in the Marxist framework. Later, a new kind of understanding came up through the elite theorization, or it was also called the circulation of elite of Pareto and Mosca. Much later, when the Americans started to theorize political sociology, especially after World War II, scholars like Talcott Parsons began to think in terms of behavioral and functionalist perspectives. Thank you so much.